Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we speak with the CEO and founder of Taking Back the Narrative, Laureen Lipsky, about her journey into Zionist education. Let's get started. Welcome. And first of all, what I'd like to ask, maybe briefly, what is your background that has led you to becoming an activist and an educator in the area of Jewish history and Jewish education? And specifically, maybe your history within the liberal media and activism groups, things like that.
Yeah, so I tend to think I have a very unique story because most people that I've encountered, at least in the Zionism education space, all grew up very Zionist, have continued to be Zionist their whole life. And most of their, the people that they interact with on a daily basis are all Zionists, right? They don't encounter the anti-Zionism trends, the anti-Semitism. So for me, I didn't even know that I was a Jew until I was about 7 or 8 years old. So I'm first generation American. Both of my parents came from Belarus. And so growing up under communism, they obviously knew that they were Jewish, but everything had to be very hidden. They only knew about Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Pesach, and that had to be kept very under wraps because maybe many in your audience know there were spies under communism rule. And it wasn't just the government, it was also your neighbors. And so when you live in even a house, the house was shared with 3-4 different families. The other families are not Jewish, there are spies everywhere. And so when my parents immigrated here, they were so busy establishing themselves. They didn't really think to explore their, faith, culture more. And so I remember my grandparents would just come over for these nice dinners a couple times a year. And I didn't know why. I was like, okay, great. I'm having my grandparents here. And then the story of how I found out I was a Jew was fascinating. I was watching Lassie, so I'm dating myself to some of your audience. And for anyone who's watched Lassie, the protagonist is a little Christian blonde boy, right? And so every night before bed, he would pray to Jesus on his knees, cross himself. I, being an impressionable child, would do the same thing. And I probably did this for a couple of weeks straight. And one day my father walks by my room and he says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, Dad, I'm just praying to Jesus before bed." And he said, "We need to have a conversation." So that's when I found out I was a Jew. So I was thrilled, right? Like, to me, this was welcome news. And I wanted to go to Hebrew school because where I grew up, it was about 25% Jewish. Like, no one was Orthodox, but, just more Reform, conservative. And the rest were Catholic Italian kids. My bat mitzvah then was approaching years later. I had a babysitting business. I even offered to pay for free Hebrew classes, or I offered to pay for Hebrew classes on my own. And they again said, "No, but we'll do you one better. We will take you to Israel and you will have a bat mitzvah on top of the Masada." So off to Israel we went. So that was my first international trip. They rented a rabbi who was also a tour guide, very, very liberal rabbi. And so, so we went up to the Masada, had my Haftorah transliterated. And I remember he was talking about Anne Frank because around that time, that's what we were learning in school. He wanted to make it age appropriate. But I was holding on more to the story that he had told about the warriors on top of Masada who had sacrificed themselves rather than being victims of the Roman occupiers. And to me, that moved me actually much more than anything he had said about Anne Frank. Unfortunately, within a year of that, I became anti-Israel. I started reading the New York Times. I started watching CNN. I started reading The Economist. I was an interesting 14-year-old. And so those publications and those media outlets really affected my opinion on this homeland that I had just visited and had just such positive experiences in. And so I would frame my anti-Israel, anti-Zionism nearly 2 decades in 2 different segments. So the first segment was definitely affected by the media for sure. And then after college, I moved to New York straight away. But, this is one of the most populated Jewish cities. I didn't have any Jewish friends. I thought I was a WASP. I joined the junior league. All my friends were non-Jewish. And so in conversation, Israel would come up sometimes when it would be in the news, and they would look to me, their token Jewish friend, and they would ask me, can you explain, because I'm not really getting anything from the news. And I would repeat the anti-Semitic tropes that I was hearing in the media, that, Israel's occupying lands, the settlements are an impediment to peace. Everything you hear, I was repeating it like an anti-Semitic parrot. So then I thought, okay, I need some more Jewish friends, or I need Jewish friends. So I joined all of the Jewish organizations in New York. I mean, name an organization I was a member of. And some of these organizations build themselves as pro-Israel. And I remember being even afraid to join. I remember being afraid of AIPAC, which is crazy to say. But to me, it was such at the time, such a right-wing, pro-Zionist organization. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this. I characterize that other decade as the second phase, because although I was part of those Jewish organizations, some of them, like I said, pro-Israel, they all were using anti-Semitic terms like West Bank and Palestinians and Palestine and, like I said, settlements. And I thought, okay, great. So Palestinians are a people. They're an ethnicity. That's what came across. So every people, every ethnicity must have a homeland. That must be Palestine. And then I coupled that with what I'm still hearing in the media at the time. I was still watching CNN. I was like, okay, so Jews are in the wrong. And how come Jews can't make peace? If only Israel did this, if only Israel did that. So then my anti-Semitism culminated in 2013. I went to an event to hear Natan Sharansky speak. And I remember at the end during the Q&A session, I raised my hand so loud and proud. And all I wanted to confront him with was, why does Israel keep building settlements? They're such an impediment to peace. So I was spared embarrassment because another ignorant Jew had asked the very same question. And Natan had said, listen, there's no such thing as settlements. Those are legal Jewish communities. And on he went. I left. I was pissed. I thought that he was an agent of Israel. He was Hasbara in a negative connotation, of course. So this was 2013. Less than a year later was the first Hamas war, 2014. And I had come home from work. I'm watching CNN post-work, as I had usually done, and they're giving airtime to Hamas terrorists and no airtime whatsoever to anyone from Israel. Something during that broadcast triggered me to, and I know that's a very leftist thing to say, but something stirred in me to figure out the truth. And so I'd gone on Facebook and I had seen a video from this woman who was documenting the missiles that were flying over basically her backyard. And I was thinking, I'm not seeing this on TV anywhere, on any channel. And I didn't even consider, and this is crazy, but this actually will tie in a little bit later to why so many Jewish Americans are anti-Israel. I never really considered Israel to have been my homeland because I was running around thinking I was a white person, that my family was from Russia, and Germany and Austria, which is how can also your family be for so many places? But that's another story. I never quite grasped that Israel is my homeland and that I'm a Jew, because I grew up secular. So I thought, okay, so Israel is more for religious people, because I thought Judaism is a religion. It's not. We're a people that has a faith, that has a culture. Moving forward, so I would share anything I had learned with my network once a week. That increased to maybe once a day, a couple times a day. And in the meantime, I really studied not only just the history of Israel, which obviously is important, but also the history of the entire Middle East and also ancient Jewish history. And I really wanted to fill in the blanks because from all the Jewish groups that I've been part of and organizations, they only spoke about biblical times, and then they would completely shift over to 1948, where they would use words like Israel was created or established. And so I wanted to find out what happened to those 2,000 years. Were any Jews there? Because again, the narrative is that for 2,000 years, Jews left and only came back as victims of the Holocaust. And so around 2019, I started writing op-eds. And so I write about Israel and politics, American and international, anti-Semitism, Zionism. Again, was so involved with so many organizations, and I realized none of them are serving the needs for actual Zionism education. So that's what prompted me to launch Taking Back the Narrative, which is my own initiative and company. And it's a Zionism education company where we fill in those 2,000-year gap. We emphasize accurate terminology. And we also emphasize that being a Zionist is not being anti-Arab. I'm actually very pro-Arab. I just spent 6 months ago, 3 weeks traveling across the Arab world, Egypt and Jordan, Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE. I really emphasize that partnership as well, right? Like when too many organizations that I see, they only focus on other Jews. I think that really is the future of combating anti-Semitism, educating others in order to push back on the anti-Semitic lies.
I think that's very, very noble. And in one of our previous podcasts, we discussed the idea, I myself am a teacher, and the idea that it is so difficult to even use the word Zionism anymore because of the various, fake UN agreements that Zionism equals racism and that Zionism is a terrible thing. And we talked in my podcast about how, as a teacher, as an educator, it is almost toxic, especially because education tends to be on the left. Educators tend to be left side leaning. And so I just think it's interesting to call something Zionist education. How do you not worry, I guess, about being labeled? I mean, nowadays the word Zionist is almost equal to, well, literally is to some equal to racist. And in this day and age, so to create Zionist education almost seems like a scary thought to me as an educator. So how do you use that term and not scare people off, I guess, is maybe one of my questions.
So I think it's the complete opposite, right? So first of all, we need to stop as Jews, as a entire, race and community, we have to stop being so afraid of what other people think.
Agreed.
So that can be applied to the Israeli government. Let's not care what the EU thinks, which is mostly anti-Semitic. Let's not care what America thinks, depending on the administration, very anti-Semitic, right? And other administrations a little bit less so. Do what's best for your country, right? Like, look at Egypt and Jordan. They are very secure countries. I was just there because they don't care. They have checkpoints everywhere. Like try going from Alexandria to Cairo. You'll have checkpoints coming in, checkpoints coming out. They don't care. Citizens don't like it. Doesn't matter. This is for your benefit. UN doesn't like it. Who cares? This is how we combat terrorism. So going back to your point about Zionism, we have to understand that we as Jews are Zionists. We come from the land of Zion. That's who we are. That's our identity. And the more I think we equip other Jews with accurate information and the pride, right, that we are part of a people and we are indigenous to the land of Israel, then that's just the natural next connection to say we're Zionists, right? And so there's a little bit of a controversy when non-Jews call themselves Zionists, right? Like some people will, look a little bit askance, like you're Christian, how can you be a Zionist? You're a Muslim, how can you be a Zionist? So for me, I actually welcome that, right? Because what is Zionism? Zionism is just the belief that, and actuality, or the recognition that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel and have a right to sovereignty in their own land. That's all that Zionism is.
Agreed.
And so just being comfortable with who we are is the actual antidote to all the backlash.
I agree fully. I mean, again, in the podcast, we talked a lot about the fact how sad it is. And you even mentioned it earlier in what you were saying, is that we as Jewish people, due to colonialization and all this other stuff in Judea and Samaria, whatever, we have been trained to somehow only tie our Judaism back to our grandparents' generation, which is sort of the idea of, oh, I'm a Jew from Spain, I'm a Jew from Poland. Well, no, that's not a thing. And like you said, it's kind of weird that we never really think and question that. Like, why do I have Jewish grandparents from this place or this place or this? No, we all came from the one place. And it's this weird gap that we've created for ourselves due to this colonial mindset, which is one of the podcasts we had done. This idea that we have literally blanked out our own history, which is so sad to say. So Zionism is just the idea that we believe that we do come from a place that was always there and we've always been there. And it was due to the colonization that we got kicked out and then expelled and then brought back and so on and so on. So it is very interesting.
And I had listened to that podcast and I was so proud that you were even mentioning that, because it's true. Because how come, we are so upset about the colonization of every other ethnic group, but not our own.
Agreed.
Right. But also it's true. We can be upset about what happened to us. But one of the focal points that I, really try to emphasize is let's not characterize the anti-Semitic lie that Jews are weak. We're not. We as Jews come from warrior stock. Just look at our ancient history. Look at, for example, 1100 AD, what happened in the Battle of Haifa. You had the Crusaders, they were held back for a month. Can you imagine holding back with all those fleets of zealous, Christians attacking you? And they were held back a month in Haifa by mostly Jews. Or what about going back to the Moorish invasion of Spain, right? Jews helped with that because the Christians were so anti-Semitic towards the Jews living there that they welcomed the Moorish, the more invasions, and they helped them tremendously. There was actually, I don't remember the name exactly, but there was actually a Jew who led one of the Muslim armies. Later on, the Moors were anti-Semitic, but not in the beginning.
I think it was one of my earlier podcasts. I had read Barry Weiss's book where she says that anti-Semitism is essentially sort of when a country is collapsing and getting to the part of, that bare scab bottom, always anti-Semitism is always under there. So it's crazy when things start to get bad. When things are great, no one cares about the Jewish people and what they're doing and what,
Right.
It's only when things get bad we need someone to blame, which goes for almost all cultures, not just Christians or Muslims or whatever. It's actually pretty sad.
Absolutely. And then also we have to understand too, and I really, really emphasize this to everyone because most Jews don't understand it. The Greeks and the Romans and the Byzantines were not anti-Semitic. They think, because, they destroyed temples and exiled. No, that was just de rigueur of the day. You conquer a people, you destroy their society. And by the way, and Jews did the same thing. when Jewish tribes conquered other tribes and absorbed them, we also decimated their societies.
For sure.
So to go back to my history with liberal media, which I had mentioned, and activism groups, that sums it up, right? I unfortunately had miseducation from both sides.
So do you see it as sort of, I hate to say, and this is kind of part of what you do, it's the lack of education, leaving that hole for anybody, but Jewish people especially, to get into, where if it's not filled with facts and reality, it's going to be filled with whatever's on the media, which is unfortunately, or in activist groups that are not going to be accurate. And it's almost the default, unfortunately, is now being anti-Israel until proven otherwise, which is such a sad reality.
And I think too, a lot of Jews, and I'll say Jewish groups because they're in this professionally, they don't realize how much anti-Israel media is out there. Anyone can just go on Instagram, and I live on Instagram just for what I do. I post daily educational posts, but there are thousands, maybe even millions, but I've seen thousands of pages that completely erase Israel. They'll have, Haifa, Palestine, or they'll have the map of Israel with Palestine. They'll say, the Palestinians are ancient people and all the Jews are Khazars, which is why it's very important to know who we are and where we actually come from. All Jews are European from Khazars, but then they don't explain where the Mizrahi Jews come from.
Agreed. Big flaw in that theory.
Right. And so I think the exposure needs to be there because, look, there are great groups out there that, just have very good PC programming for other Jews, but they're not moving the needle forward. I'm not saying this in a negative way. I'm just saying what actually is needed to combat anti-Semitism. And it's not to pat ourselves in the back. Oh, look, we had a program on Herzl. Look, we had a program on San Remo. We need to actually emphasize, when JNS, a fairly right-wing publication, I used to write for them. I stopped just because they were using so many anti-Semitic terminology. They would change my op-eds, first of all, to be more PC, which is a little bit crazy. Whereas when I would submit to non-Jewish publications like American Thinker, Washington Examiner, The Federalist, they wouldn't change my voice at all. But it's the Jewish publications that change it all around. Allgemeiner, JNS, you'll submit something with legal Jewish communities, you'll get back settlements. Judea and Samaria comes back West Bank. Who are we trying to kid, right? Like, we ourselves as Jews have to know our own history, and we have to know the history of the land. We have to know the history of the Middle East in order to not do more damage.
Yeah. Do you think that the reason why these people are changing the words and the narratives is for the Jewish people, or you think that they're so afraid of, being called out, or I don't want to be seen as a Zionist? Like, is it for the Jews, the non-Jews, or for everybody? They're just so afraid of using those words.
It's definitely for Jews, because the Jewish publications are not read by non-Jews. They're just not. Just like we don't read, I don't know, let's say Christian, probably oriented publications. But what's happening, and I saw it firsthand, I was very much part of Alga Minor. I even sat on their a young editors committee, and I had seen the shift to the left of the young leadership board. And as soon as the shift happened, right, so how do most of these publications and nonprofits, they have to cater to the board. And so the same thing, I was part of CAMRA, the young leadership board here. They were doing amazing work. That's great. But the board was left. And so suddenly, we can't say Judea and Samaria. And oh my gosh, you're not saying Palestinians, you're so right wing. I get it all the time from so-called Zionism influencers who are on Instagram. And I'll reach out and I'll say, first of all, I have Muslim Zionist, educators who do not say Palestinians. And there's this great story. I don't know if you're familiar with Mohammed Kabia.
I don't think offhand, no.
Okay, so he's someone to know. If you could get him on your podcast, that would be great. I'm just suggesting podcast guests here. So he is a Bedouin, very proud Bedouin, Israeli. He served in the IAF, and his life's mission is to increase Israeli military participation among his community and to make them more pro-Israel. There's a whole story behind that. So in actuality, a lot of the Bedouins in Israel are genetically Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so the Bedouins in 48 very much helped Israel win the war. They were desert trackers. So why I mention him, he's an excellent, whether you want to call him an Israel activist, Muslim, Zionist, it doesn't matter. He had responded to Amnesty International. Maybe this was 2 years ago when they did that whole anti-Israel campaign. They blamed Israel for being racist towards Palestinians in apartheid. And so Mohammed Kabia had replied very publicly on Twitter, and he had said, "How dare you call me a Palestinian? I have 3,500 years of proud Bedouin heritage in my veins. I am no Palestinian." And so that's the thing, like when we rename ethnicities, right? Like it's actually not just anti-Jewish to say Palestinian, it's also anti-Arab. Many of these Arabs come from rich lineages, right? Like Tunisian, Moroccan, and Saudi and Egyptian. How dare we erase all of that into just where they happen to live for the last 3 or 4 generations.
Yeah. And I'm sure, and I know for a fact actually from people that I've spoken to, that unfortunately the Palestinian Arab moniker is almost a negative among many Arab nations. They find them as to be like lower than, so it's almost like an insult even to have to put that name on people. But unfortunately it has become somewhat of a rallying cry for those who have picked it up for various reasons, which you and I will get into in a minute. Right. But it's a sad reality that these people have been punished and continue to be punished. And in my podcast, I often talk about how they are the ones getting the worst end of the stick. I think there was a podcast we did called Palestine is Free. And the fact is that the quote unquote Palestinian Arabs, the ones who live in Israel, so Israeli Arabs, have a much better life than any of their brethren, even in their own independent countries. And yet here we are trying to free them from this occupier who treats them better and has given them a better life than even their own people give them. So it's just such a shame that people who are activists are really fighting the wrong side here.
Sorry. And I think like there has to be like a psychological analysis of this situation because, like for me, I was just ignorant, I'll admit, right? Like my anti-Semitism came from sheer ignorance. But a lot of these people hopefully do know some more history than I did. And I've been talking to some experts and they were saying that, as Israel grows in strength, right, it's the 8th most powerful country in the world, was voted a couple of years ago. Obviously, Israel's military, is very powerful as well. some of the Jews who are self-hating, who propagate, these anti-Semitic lies, there must be some kind of false feeling of guilt, right? Like, oh my gosh, like Jews are supposed to be weak, we're always supposed to be the victim, and now we're not the victim anymore.
It's a good point. I mean, I there's always been that classic. I know it's in Poland at the Warsaw Museum. And it's also in Yad Vashem. Is the weak Jew statues where they were walking away in shame versus the strong Jews who were fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I definitely think that we, as a people, have to kind of come to terms with the fact that if we aren't those strong Jewish people who are fighting back, we're gone. And I think it was like Golda Meir who made that comment, like, if we put down our weapons, there'll be no Israel. If they put down their weapons, it'll be peace. And I hate to say, for the most part, it's almost exactly true.
Yeah, I think we just need to get rid of this guilt complex for what? For surviving and thriving. And something else that I look to, have you heard of Professor Ruth Weiss? I forgot how to say her last name.
If not offhand.
Okay, I will send you a link. She's great. So she's an advocate for Holocaust education reform. And this is really important in terms of Zionism education as well, because she was saying that, the way the Holocaust is taught in America, at least, is completely incorrect. I know my liberal friends and family, they're so focused on the Holocaust as if that's the only part of Jewish history that ever happened, right? It's like, they think that we all were slaves in Egypt, and then the Holocaust happened. And then Israel was created. And then Israel was created in 48. And so I think when we only, and I'm not saying like not to teach about the Holocaust. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that we should not remember the Holocaust and never let it die. Again, not saying that. But we need to understand that Jews are so much more than this horrific atrocity that happened to us. We've had 4,000 years of history. And yes, we've had our downfalls to our nation, but what's important to remember, we've also had many victories, we've had many strengths, and out of all of the civilizations that we had that had been our contemporaries, we're one of the few that's left, right? It's like us and the Indians and the Chinese.
Yeah.
Where are the others?
Yeah.
Right.
I think the most recent podcast I did was being the chosen people, and the fact that there's literally no reason why the Jewish people are still here based on history, anti-Semitism, war, whatever. Like, there's no rational reason why we're still here and in our ancestral homeland. It's like almost an impossibility, but somehow we did it.
But in a way, there is a rational explanation because we're so tough, right? So I remember being on Ammunition Hill on a GNF trip back in 2015. And so they were sharing a story that, the Battle of Ammunition Hill was the final battle before Jerusalem was reunited. So the Israeli had asked, what were your thoughts, like as a general, like during that war? And so the Jordanian leader had said something to the effect of, we were shocked because we put our best men forward. We fought as hard as we could. Why did your side win? And so the Israeli general had said, or the Israeli military attaché had said, because we have nowhere else to go. This is our home.
It's very true. I mean, I believe that very strongly, especially when you look at the 67 war, and we have the people who gave up their lives to hold on to Gush Etzion and a whole bunch of other amazing places.
But, and the Gush Etzion block, what happened there, right? Like all those communities were decimated. But even before that, what about, I'm doing a lot of research right now on the Bar Kokhba revolts.
Yes.
I mean, come on, right? That was amazing bravery. So I think more Jews need to be proud of our history.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be proud of.
I know we don't have too much time left, but I do want to get to, I know that you've spoken a lot about, I guess, the research that's being done on Operation SIG in the history of the Soviet Union and how that plays a role. So if you can really quickly give a kind of a brief overview, and then maybe we could talk about it a little bit.
Of course. So the Soviet Union was the first to recognize Israel at the UN. And so many falsely understand, it's not true, that the UN did not create Israel. Jews liberated Israel from the British occupation. It took them almost 20 years to do so. It was very much Jewish effort. All the UN did was merely recognize Jewish sovereignty in Israel. So the Soviet Union, they thought, great, we'll recognize Israel very first, because their goal was to make Israel a communist vassal state. At the time, there were more Soviet Jews were coming in who were socialists. Israel was socialist, like, in the beginning decades, but then more Jews were learning about the atrocities of the gulags, and they were obviously aghast at that, coupled with then in 56, Israel was on the side of America and France during the Suez Canal War. So
let's not forget the Soviet Union was funding and helping and supporting all of the Arab nations in there and selling weapons.
Right. So, but that was in 56. So in the beginning, so the Soviet Union was not involved in 48 at all. Like, yes. They were not part of, it was the Brits who were training and funding the Arab armies at that point.
Yes.
So in 56, it was the Soviets. So yes, of course, Israel pissed them off on both fronts, right? It no longer wanted to be the Soviet vassal state, sided with their enemies. And so what they did, so in 64, and this is where a lot of people get confused with dates. So in 1964, what happened? During the Arab League summit in Cairo, the PLO was formed. So the KGB supported them, but they did not invent the PLO. That's a misconception. So that was 64. I remember in 64, what was Article 24 of the PLO charter? They had no interest in the West Bank because it was controlled by Jordan, and they had no interest in Gaza because it was controlled by Egypt, right? They thought everything else was this Palestinian settlement that they wanted. Okay, so the KGB in 67 was so aghast that Israel dared to win the war, where they sunk in so much money into these Arab armies. They unleashed Operation SIG. So it actually stands for this really long 3-word acronym in Russian. I don't remember what, even though I speak Russian, like it's even I couldn't pronounce it. But what it was from 67 to 1988, so this spanned decades. It was a campaign to label Israel as a colonizer, as a Nazi state. The Protocols of the Elder of Zion, which was the most anti-Semitic document the Soviet Union had ever produced, was completely dispersed around the world. And so what they did, first of all, they had hired Arafat and trained him as an agent. They had hired and trained Abbas as an agent. So Abbas had been sent then to Lebanon to work. Arafat, we know what happened with him. So the Soviets had hired 4,000 Arab undercover agents to spread anti-Semitic lies throughout the Arab world. So in the Arab world, those lies stuck. But the Soviets had problems in the West, right? Because the West wasn't really, because remember, even liberals around 67, because Israel was an underdog, remember the left loves, the weak underdogs.
Always.
So they actually were supporting Jews. Like, there was no anti-Israel sentiment in 67, like in the West at all. Left, right, it didn't matter. But so what they had to do, they had to infect academia with anti-Semitic lies. And so, we have a common term in the US now called useful idiots, but that came from the Soviet Union. So they called anyone who would be used as an aid to spread their propaganda as useful idiots. And so they saw this opening in academia, right? Like impressionable young students. You already had leftist professors in a lot of the colleges. This is a perfect opportunity. There's so many images of Israel portrayed as Nazis, as vermin, just to completely demonize, Jews and elevate, these poor Arabs and how they're being, stabbed in the back and they're being mistreated. The whole apartheid notion, where did that come from Operation SIG. And so they had, and I mentioned this in the beginning, they had unleashed this false national liberation movement of the Palestinians. And if you think about it from a strategic place, objectively, it was brilliant, right? All they did was take a term that they knew was associated with Jews for thousands of years and left it, in a very anti-Semitic manner. So they united Arabs that had nothing in common. Like, who are the Arabs in Gaza? Who are Gazans? They're mostly Egyptians, some Saudis mixed in, but culturally, they don't have much in common with the Arabs who are now living in Judea and Samaria.
One last thing that I wanted to ask is, why do you think, I did some research. I actually wasn't too familiar with the Operation SIG. I know a lot of it's now based on sort of somewhat current-ish testimonies of defectors and things like that. I found the paper that was written, and it's all well-sourced and cited, but no one else is talking about it. Why do you think that there's such a quiet around this situation?
That's an excellent question. And as something I was thinking about it myself, because when I was, first of all, researching and writing for my own website, and then I was doing research and writing for my classes, I found literally one comprehensive document that happened to be academic. And you can have a whole podcast, by the way, on the fallacies of academic research regarding Israel. I mean, 99% of it is inaccurate, but this one paper definitely was, and I would love to even email it to you.
Sure.
I use it as a reference. But I honestly blame Jewish academia for that. They're the ones who are not pushing it forward. They're the ones maybe, I hate to say the word, maybe even suppressing it if it doesn't fit their narrative. Because if this were, you're right, like if this were actually out there, the whole narrative would change.
It's interesting. I mean, maybe the world is kind of afraid of facts to disprove what we've been. I think I said in my podcast before, like you almost get so far down where you can't turn around and go, yeah, it turns out the last like 40 years we made a big mistake and this was all whatever. Mm-hmm. You can't do that. So you just have to keep pushing forward and pushing forward and push. Even if stuff comes up that disproves it, you're like, it's my view is still okay, because otherwise that I've been wasting 20 years of my life or whatever. You don't want to be admitting that. So
it's true. And this is why we have to thank Arabs. Like, look at what Saudi Arabia did. I always say, but people, especially the Jewish media, loves to say like, oh, like Saudi Arabia said this and said, I said, don't pay attention to what Saudi Arabia says. Pay attention to what Saudi Arabia does. And they have to be careful too. So I have an anecdote about this. One of my Facebook friends was in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic. And her conference venue was canceled because the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had rented out the whole place. Obviously, they took his reservation to be above theirs. So the Crown Prince had seen her, looking really confused in the lobby and invited her to their dinner. So she joined the Crown Prince for dinner and actually sat next to him. And he had asked her, so like, what do you do for work? And so she said, I work in the tech community and I'm also very involved in the Jewish community. I don't think she said that on purpose, like to have an aha. It just came out. And he had said, I love the Jewish community. And he said, I'm very pro-Israel. So this was right in the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic.
Wow.
But he said, the only issue in my country is the older generation and the mullahs. And you can tell because the younger generation is pro-Israel. And so Saudi Arabia just did this entire counter anti-Semitic campaign. They got rid of anti-Semitism in their mosques, in their schools, in their media.
So actually, one question I was really curious about to ask you, in your work as someone who's educating people on the facts on the ground, history is great, but how do we or what's your opinion on solving or improving the situation on the ground? We could feel great knowing we're in the right, historically speaking and morally speaking, but the reality is there are still people, unfortunately, they're teaching their children to kill us and to bomb things and you'll go to heaven. How do you, I guess, put those two things together?
So I think there needs to be a separation that I'm convinced of. So Zionism educators are not policymakers, right? So what Israel does is none of my concern. That I'm not Israeli. I don't pay taxes there. Never served in the military. I think the role of Zionism educators, especially outside of Israel, is literally to combat anti-Semitism, right? Which is pushing back on all the falsehoods about Jews, about Israel, because 90% of anti-Semitic physical attacks, propaganda, slander stems from anti-Zionism, right? It's just the truth. Not that many people right now think that Jews are walking around with horns, or even, yes, the killing Jesus is still alive and well, as we saw with Jamie Foxx in certain communities, but it's dying down in reality. So the best thing we can do is not attach ourselves too much to what Israel is doing. But it takes the leadership of the Israeli government at some point. It takes Jews themselves to use accurate terminology. Like how many, what's his name? Who was that comedian? Jon Stewart.
Yeah.
Just recently, he said, like, as a Jew, and then listed all of the atrocities supposedly that Israel committed, and that's not accurate. And he went on national TV with a non-Jewish guest to foment all of that anti-Semitism. And that's the trend, unfortunately, I'm seeing. You have Seth Rogen. Remember, he did as a Jew. So it's this as a Jew.
Tokenization.
Right. Like, but it's not even that. It's like, as a Jew, like this anti-Semitic phenomenon. So of course, like think about this from the outside perspective. If I were not Jewish and I didn't know much about Israel and I see these Jewish celebrities say like, as a Jew, I'm against what Israel does, why wouldn't I believe them? Right. Because as a Jew, we as a collective have to take some responsibility because, you know, there are, let's say, Egyptians living abroad, Egypt, that might not agree with Egypt does, but they know not to say anything, right? So like we are more democratically minded people. But if Israel were to like maybe clamp down a little bit more and again, not be so caring of what anti-Semitic countries think of their measures, it might change a lot of methods.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming and sharing your views, sharing your information about your work that you're doing. We'll put a link in the description for the podcast. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor. And I just really want to emphasize it. Education, you know, when people say, especially Jews say, like, how can we combat, you know, anti-Semitism? And especially the younger generation, I see it, like, you know, they're so upset about anti-Semitism and they're worried and their entire, you know, Instagram pages dedicated to, you know, highlighting anti-Semitism. All it takes is actual education as the best tool to combat. We're never going to erase anti-Semitism, right? Again, we have, as a people, dealt with it for, you know, thousands of years. Unfortunately, future generations of Jews will deal with it too. However, if we want to take some responsibility and try to combat anti-Semitism, put a dent in anti-Semitism, Zionism education is the only way to do it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at JDR Podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.